now I think we've got our new speakers connected. We're going to go on to this next session. Tell us a little bit about that and who we're going to hear from.
We are going to hear from two sacred animals in the digital government world, Siim and Paul. And I think Andreas' presentation this morning, and of course you, Jen, this was like a nice shot of black coffee. I think we'll just continue the same way, because Siim and Paul are two other shots of black coffee, and I get already a little bit excited here. No, you may know them. I still say who they are. Siim Sikkut is the government Cio of Estonia, an old friend of many of his peers across Europe, an old friend of creating a stronger European cooperation on digital government, but one that in particular gives this freedom to the local level. He was an advisor to the Prime Minister for many years. He is a Director General in the ministry in Tallinn. But above all, he is one of the senior members of the group of government CIOs across Europe who are steering and advising much of the European digital government work. He was also one of the forces behind the Tallinn Declaration on e-government that sort of puts down a new speed to digital government. And here I make the link to Paul Hofheinz, who is the co-founder of the respected Brussels-based think tank Lisbon Council, and who was part of this conversation, part of this debate from very early on. The Lisbon Council put e-government, digitalization of the public sphere very early on the agenda. And what I like a lot about it, also very quickly with startups, support schemes for startups, and the debate about data access, open data exchange, things that drive us today and connect nicely. So the two of them were involved in the drafting, the preparation, the negotiation of the Tallinn Declaration. The two of them were also very much involved in the preparations of the Berlin Declaration. And our question to the two of them would be, can we go from declaration to declaration? Or is it that we now see declaration, implementation? Do we have our two guests already on stage?
Gentlemen, I think they're there. Paul and Siim, very welcome to you. I think perhaps, Siim, you'd like to go first in response to Max's question.
Well, first of all, hello, and to exactly all the friends around Europe, and hi, Paul, as well. I think it's the first time I have been called a sacred animal, so there you go. But no, it's been quite a journey since Tallinn Declaration, and thanks really for reminding all of that. It's actually 4 or even more years now, and indeed, when we were doing Tallinn Declaration, then we were very keen to see that actually delivery has to happen. If you look at sort of even how the text is being framed and some of the discussions we had with colleagues around European countries, was to say, look, how can we make it the most practical, as opposed to just sort of fluffy wordings? How can we make it this way that what we put on paper is implementable and should be implemented as fast as possible? And I think on that, I mean, and I'll perhaps happy to hear Paul's view, who was very much with me and us there through the journey of making this declaration. Through that, what we have seen is that so countries and regions who really have put their mind to it actually have made great use of it.
Thank you. Would you like me to come in now?
Yes, Paul, please go.
Oh, good. Okay, absolutely, sure. Look, I think, first of all, thank you, Siim. I've never been called a sacred animal either, or a shot of coffee, but I like to think a compliment's intended in there somewhere, but I'm not so sure. Look, I first of all, any contribution we made to this declaration was a mere shadow of what you did personally, Siim, and also what the Estonian government did to really not just define this agenda, but even more crucially, to show us what was possible, because that's very important. At the end of the day, we need to demonstrate identifiable gains to citizens, and that's not an easy thing. And let me say why. Digital government is tricky. It's very easy to come up with slogans. In fact, by the way, you had a very good one a minute ago, Max. We need to move from words to deeds. Yes, of course, we do need to move from words to deeds. My point is that's a very easy thing to say, The trick is to make sure that that's what actually happens. And there we have a very great responsibility, because the dossier is, first of all, highly technical. I don't think I need to tell anyone at this event or this meeting how much difficulty is involved in a concept that sounds as simple as interoperability. But it's highly technical, and at the end of the day, we need to be able to, number one, make it work. It's a permanent ICT challenge. And secondly, make sure that citizens understand what we're doing and why. And in that context, I think these declarations can be tremendously helpful. Not so much for what they say in the end, although what they say in the end is important, but for the process of drafting them. They bring us together in the effort to find a common vision, a common roadmap, and that process itself is very helpful. I guess I just, maybe before I shut up, I'll say one more thing, which is the declaration, in many ways, as important as it is only halfway down the road. It is the first half down the road, but it's not the second. And the second half of the way down the road is what you mentioned a moment ago, Max, the implementation. We need to monitor, we need to follow closely what we did, not for this, and I hate these words, naming and shaming, but just to see what's happening where and when and where we might be able to do better. And in that context, we can all learn from each other, including my good friends in Estonia, who tend to set the standard for this, but not always. We all learn from each other, and we like that.
Absolutely. And I mean, if I can continue from this, look, Tallinn Declaration, even if it bears, our capital's name, even if it was done through our presidency, it has sort of footprints and sort of ambitions really from all over Europe, and many colleagues in the CIO group, in the e-government steering board, and so on, and then political level, of course. So it's by no means like an Estonian way of imposing in Europe. No, quite the contrary. I mean, the declaration actually was built up to be a roadmap in how to build digital services better from users' point of view, from cross-border point of view, and so on. But also it was meant to be even challenging for those of us who have managed to perhaps make a bit of more progress in public services. So even in Estonia, we have had to work towards making some of that happen, right? But I want to say two things. What's been really sort of interesting for me to say, and why I said that countries and regions who have put their mind to it have made great progress based on something like the Tallinn Declaration. I mean, our good friends from Czechia. So what they told me is that they came in a year or two after the Tallinn Declaration had happened, and they just took it as a manual. They just basically said, look, I mean, let's take this one by one and make it happen. And they make great strides now in digital government in their place. So these things exactly can be put to action, and if such, and something you mentioned, Paul, and I'll be keen to hear your views a bit more on that as well. But the follow-up and obviously a very sort of usual suspect way of doing things, how to make sure things are being delivered, is that there has to be some sort of monitoring and follow-up mechanism. And indeed, what we have, I think, have learned, in my view, from Tallinn Declaration side is that obviously it comes down to how that follow-up and monitoring is done on a practical level. And what we perhaps went a bit too far collectively was to make it a very sort of tedious bureaucratic exercise, as opposed to, let's say, a bigger picture view. So declarations are, in my view, meant to be strategic, and I think the follow-up and monitoring perhaps needs to be a bit more strategic as well, if I can throw in like a helicopter view on that.
Sure. Well, let me say, first of all, you stole my thunder there, Sim, because the last thing you said is what I would have said, which is the monitoring needs to be more strategic. Look, I think absolutely, in many ways, this is one of the areas where we've perhaps fallen short. There is some monitoring that goes on out there, but it's been sporadic and not always very complete. And for me, strangely controversial. There's a lot of member states out there who, when they hear about a monitoring process, get very nervous. Let me say to you, friends, don't be. We're doing this for you. We're doing this for everyone. It's a way of drawing up a picture of how and where we can do better, of what's possible in the best in the leading countries. I think when we go back to this and look at it more, monitoring and follow-up is something that we could surely stand to do more of and do better. Good indicators, good ways of measuring progress, good ways of comparing progress, and my God, a wonderful conversation that would emerge once we had that kind of systematic data at our hands to analyze. I just want to say to all of the European Union member states, you have nothing to fear in this process. That's not what we're talking about. This is not the stick side of the carrot. To the contrary, it's the essential part of the process that we need to complete it and deliver results. I wanted, if you don't mind, I wanted to say a couple of words also about the Berlin Declaration, which hasn't come up in this conversation yet. It was a very nice declaration. It reiterated and restated many of the points and the themes in the Tallinn Declaration. And that, by the way, already is very useful. I think it's a little bit, if you think of it as a marriage, it's not a bad idea to repeat your vows every couple of years. And that's more or less what the declaration did. But it also brought some very contemporary German ideas into the discussion, which were very important, and introduced for the first time the concept of co-creation. Siim, back when you and I were brainstorming about what might be possible here, that wasn't even really a thing, but it's a very big thing now. I won't indulge my sectarian interest in it, but basically it's a way of bringing civil service and citizens together to deliver this user centricity that we talk about. It's a process that's been very, very powerful over the years. So I did want to say that that's something else it can do too, that declarations can bring communities together, can hold them together. But what we need to think about is how we make sure that what we commit to is what we actually turn around and do. And there needs to maybe be a more systematic process for keeping track of that, helping each other through times of need, and delivering on all these things, not for ourselves, because my God, we're all civil servants here. Well, I'm not. Most of the people on this call are civil servants. We'll be fine. We need to deliver on this for our citizens. That's who this is all about at the end of the day.
Well, obviously with you there, and you brought that Berlin Declaration, and quite rightly so. It's definitely, as it was intended by our good German friends, to be a continuation from Tallinn, and in a way it doesn't substitute that. I mean, they both work on quite different sort of levels of operation, right? I mean, Tallinn was intended to be quite sort of exactly practical, implementable, micro bottom-up sort of stuff, right, from user point of view. Berlin, that's my iteration of it. So, you know, we'll hear from the next panel, but Berlin was very much meant to be the blanket over this, and took a much wider scope as well, looking at digital society at large, as opposed to just a public service of delivery and point. But Paul, what's your view on, I mean, on one aspect of thing that's sort of a bit this, let's say, sort of grain of salt for me in a way, is that in Tallinn Declaration, we were trying to think and propose ways and make commitments on two levels. One of them was on, let's say, level of member states and regions. So basically everything in our hands in governments, national governments, regional governments, so on. And secondly, there were expectations for you know, what should happen on cross-border and European level in the institutions, for example. And it's a bit my view that perhaps, you know, even more has happened on the first part than on the institutional part. I think the things we were talking about and sort of, you know, trying to solve back in the day when it comes to digitization and digital transformation of how European stuff works cross borders and within institutions, that's still largely to happen. Am I doing injustice?
Well, no, I don't think so. But let me make two comments in response to that, if I can. And first of all, say I'm flattered that you would ask, because most of what I know about digital government I know from you. So perhaps after this you can answer the question yourself, because I would love to hear your perspective on it. For me, one of the first things we noticed when we got interested in this process is something you mentioned in passing, the relationship of national government to local government. We have declarations that national governments sign, but at the end of the day, local government is where most people get their public services. So obviously, local government needs to be made a part of this process in a more ongoing and more systematic way. It's very easy to see a breakdown take place because a national government is committed to things that perhaps local administrations are not a part of yet. We need very much to involve them in this process. In terms of what you mentioned about interinstitutional in Europe, well, yes, I think we could all stand to see a bit more progress there. This whole conference for 4 days, that's what we'll be talking about. Someone mentioned to me the other day the idea that one thing we could do urgently, low-hanging fruit, was make it that all European level services were digital by default. We could do a lot of these things with the power of the European administration right away. And as I'm sure you know, in Estonia there, getting these things right is a fantastic way of making them happen, because once people see good things happening in one place, there's a lot more pressure to replicate them elsewhere. So that would be my answer for the European Union to mandate this within the power that it has for its own administration, and to use that as a vanguard for driving change throughout the European Union. Does that make sense to you from your perch in Estonia?
No, absolutely, because I mean that was exactly our sort of thinking behind when we brought that sort of dimension in, calling upon Commission to do certain things and so on. But I think when we come to low-hanging fruits, and this, I agree, this sort of conference here over the 2 days is quite topical, because exactly there's still lots of stuff we've talked about so long but not implemented. So if you take interoperability, for example, interoperability framework, then my view and my government's view is that clearly that stuff should be implemented tomorrow on European cross-border level at least, right? The building blocks, I mean, they should be non-negotiably, mandatory for all Commission-led services, for example, right? The stuff that we all have to adhere to cross-border. Otherwise, we just get stuck in discussions forever and forever. So I would exactly give us all a bit of collective sort of kick in the butt and try to do more on that front, because that takes us further all at once. And by the way, that doesn't impede in subsidiarity, in my view. That doesn't impede in how we do things within our governments, but it solves the problem that Europe is meant to solve. How do we work together? How do we get data flowing across the borders in one zone? How do we have, the people can literally use the great 4 freedoms we have in the single market? If there's no digital data movement, these 4 freedoms don't work anymore.
Well, I think progress begins not with a lot of answers, but with a set of questions. And the questions you asked just now would, in my view, be a wonderful starting point for the discussion to follow. How do we do all of those things? And let's try to answer them.
So basically, this is exactly where I think we will be keenly also hearing a lot of, listening into what the colleagues are saying. But still on the delivery side of things, I mean, you was quite spot on in a sense of saying that, look, the local governments and others have to come to the game. I think we made a conscious choice just for very practical reasons. We saw so much stuff to be done on national levels, even, that we focused keenly there. We always like to prioritize and focus in Estonia at least. But you're quite right. I mean, we had very eager, let's say, regions wanting to be part of it and wanted to take this on board. So there's clearly something in there. But look, long story. Sorry.
If I may, just on that one point, it's as you rightly say, Siim, it's a bigger challenge for larger countries that have more regions and more localities to deal with, and that's exactly why this needs to become a part of the strategy moving forward. But let me say, in their defense, we see some regions and some local authorities who are actually very eager to move ahead of their national government. So in many instances, you'll be pushing on an open door there.
Absolutely. And I mean, although, we clearly in Estonia have always believed in collaboration and sharing, right? A bit of competition is also healthy, right? Between, be it sort of, regional or national or even between governments, friendly nudging in a way, right? But just to sort of come back to the follow-up sort of points and look, I mean, what I do believe that what has been clearly great things we have done together, and there's also been progress over the last few years since Tallinn, is obviously all the building blocks. I mean, I can't emphasize this enough, and obviously I think we'll hear a lot of this in the next 2 days, but there's so much more we can be doing just to implement them, make them sort of sustainable as building blocks, and keep adding them. I think what has been our biggest learning in Estonia is that the platform approach makes us go ahead so much stronger and also more secure and faster, not to mention cheaper. So anything we can do on that front is clearly the biggest no-brainer value added on your EU level.
Exactly. And maybe just, if I may, go back to one of the 6 principles that you articulated so well in the Tallinn Declaration, user centricity. I think it all begins and hopefully ends right there, putting citizens at the heart of this process, and building a world around them that serves them. This is in some ways a sea change. It's a different way of thinking about the way these services were provided in the past. But if we start with that principle and we put it everywhere, we can do amazing things. And I've seen some of that in the work and the research that we've done over the years. And I guess what I'm trying to say, Siim, is thank you. Thank you for the concept, and thank you for the extraordinary example that you've shown of it there in Estonia.
Well, to be honest, I think user centricity was brought in even more strongly by others. So if I think back, because I mean, that's obviously something that we have had to learn a lot in the last 5, 4, 6 years as well in Estonia. When we used to build things that are functionally beautiful and technologically perfect almost, but you not user-centric at all. So we come also with a learning curve. But what really sort of what I've learned in that process in Estonia, and I hope it sort of is something that sort of, you know, a lot of colleagues feel the same in listening to this panel of ours as well. Look, what is user centricity in the end? I think sort of, you know, exactly, you mentioned yourself, Paul, that, you know, let's think about a citizen, but who is a citizen? That's me, right? Yeah. So I think what's very easy to see is, you know, it's somewhere them, they, somewhere there. But actually, if you just, you know, take one step back, think about it, but hey, I'm really building something here for myself. That mindset change actually is a powerful impact to do different.
And part of what I like so much about the Estonian Siim, and please don't be embarrassed by this, is you always approach this humbly. I love that when I praise you for user centricity, you immediately say, well, we didn't know that much about it. And by the way, that's a very good attitude, because what it means is you always come to the table with the feeling that you have more to learn here. And that's a very important part of the example that you've set. Look, I think on user centricity, it is the sixth and last principle of that declaration. And in many ways, it's the uncharted territory. It's the place where we need to go next with our work. And there are various pilots and various pockets of success, but to argue that we have it everywhere in public administration would be to completely miss the point here. So I guess going back to the first question on monitoring, let's look at how well we're doing on user centricity. Let's find a way to measure that and benchmark ourselves and come at the discussion with the humility that you just expressed so well a moment ago.
I think that's also, just to add on this, a nice sort of segue to Berlin, because Berlin really brought the citizen focus, the user centricity to exactly like much broader level, right? Covering the whole of digital economy aspects of things and so on. So I mean, you know, if I have always looked at the discussions around ethics, in the end, that's the same thing. If I'm not doing blasphemy now.
That's right. No, I think that's exactly right. Good.
So Paul, on to Berlin, or?
Well, I see our friends and colleagues are joining us here. Jennifer, Max?
Gentlemen, we are delighted. I hate to interrupt you because you've been having such a great conversation and we didn't actually, moderators, we didn't have to do anything. You've been taking it away and it's been a delight. However, we are going to have to cut you off there, but thank you so much for your insight and for bringing the backgrounder and so on into the discussion today. We have a couple of great comments from our audience who obviously were enjoying your discussion as well. One says the Tallinn Declaration is great with regard to content. We need to make it binding in order to make it happen in reality. Stay tuned for the next 3 days, dear watcher, viewer, because we're going to talk about that. Another comment said, this year I did my Dutch tax declaration with my Estonian ID card and I'm Dutch. So cross-border identity works. I'm sure that's very heartening for everyone as well. With that, I'm going to let you go. We are going to take a short break here for 10 minutes. So have a stretch, particularly if you're watching from home, or have a breath of fresh air, have a coffee, and do come back because we will be going into one of our parallel sessions, and that will be the e-archiving session. That'll be, and you can join us here in the main stage of the studio at 10:45. Don't forget to use the hashtag DigitALL Public if you're joining on social media, and don't forget to use the chat function on the platform if you are following in there. So lots to talk about. Do join us back.